Um, I like to start this with just taking a couple of spheres and then chucking them into the face or into the head, and then I'll kind of use that as like an anchoring point to sculpt the face around them. So yeah, I'll just start by sculpting out the more prominent areas like the brow area, the brow bones, and like the nose bridge and the nose itself. So now to start making our mouth, we're gonna need to create our mouth cavity first. Even though we don't really have plans to like facially animate her or like make her talk or anything. And we're not even going to put teeth and tongue into this mouth for this project. But, just further down the line, you'll never know what will happen. So I like to just prepare a mouth cavity anyways. So we'll just chunk that out real quick. And so, yeah, with the head, especially now that we've got proper subdivisions in it instead of it being this dynameshed object, we really want to use that same concept of like building everything up together. So we're starting from the lowest subdivision, which is like the lowest resolution, and just working on the bigger areas. And as we go up in divisions, we'll add more and more detail. So now we're just kind of trying to build the face up in this softer kind of stylized way. And it really helps to have one of those planar heads around, the ones I showed in the very beginning in references. I've got mine with me in real life, but I mean, just looking at a 3D file of that on your computer is pretty much the same. It really helps you break down those super complicated realistic planes of a real face. And I mean, our girl is an even more simplified version of that. So just like being able to see those nuances in a very clear way is super helpful. And something that I found really helps me out when I'm sculpting faces is just to kind of peek at it from like all these like odd angles. Um, Especially from like under the chin and stuff like that, because if you're like an actual human and you see things from those angles, you can tell like something is a little off if it doesn't really feel like this is a functional head with like a real skull underneath. Even when it's stylized this, you can still tell where things are a little bit off. So I found that helps me a lot. So yeah, obviously the face isn't really done yet, but at this point, like my eyes are getting pretty tired from looking at the same thing for so long, and I'm not really seeing a lot of areas I need to fix. I'm doing a lot of what artists call noodling, which is just kind of pushing things around, trying to make something happen, but not really having a clear direction. So for now, we're just gonna move on to the boots and just come back to the face at a different time. With the boots, we've got this weird looking sock thing for now, which was our primary shape. So now we really have to go in and get those secondary forms out. Uh, so that's going to take just a little bit of finessing. And we're basically just using that same technique I talked about before and that I use all the time on form-fitting subtools, where you just make an extraction and only use one side of that extraction as a single-sided mesh, clean that up, and then extrude some thickness from it. And that's just to keep our mesh as clean as we can at this really low poly stage. I've also realized that at this point, I've been recording making our sweet little tea brewer, turning her model around and around and around, and I didn't put underwear on her yet. So, yeah, that's when I realized, like, I'm just gonna put something on her temporarily, like what I think she might wear as underwear, just so we can stop, like, upskirting her. Yeah, just protect her modesty a little bit. So I actually thought she would have these kind of frilly like bloomers on. I don't know why, I just thought it suited her. And later I talked with Ilsa and apparently we had the exact same underwear in mind for her. I mean, Ilsa hadn't drawn it out, but she was thinking about it as well apparently. It's a really important part of our character design. So yeah, I'm glad we're both imagining the same things. I've just dropped down the kind of primary form for these bloomers in ZBrush for now, but the plan is to go back in and finesse them out later. But yeah, at least our girl is covered for now. Alright, and now we'll move on to start turning our secondary forms into a bit more polished kind of semi-final stage. We're really just looking to define some of these more loose structures a bit more, cleaning them up a bit. So we'll start out with sculpting and solving our girl's hair, especially because she doesn't have these like perfectly curled hair locks like a Disney princess. They're a bit more like rough around the edges and a bit more natural. So I really wanted to go in there and make sure these weren't like perfectly rounded pieces. And now we're just building the details on top of that to support these kind of wonky hair shapes. So for the ends of the hair tails, these like poofy bits at the bottom, I kind of just mimicked the shape that was in the concept from Ilsa, but it didn't really feel quite right in 3D. Like I felt like the hair for the actual like hair tail itself versus the poof were kind of like two different hair textures. And 2D artists are kind of like magicians, and sometimes things will look right in the 2D concept, but when you start to dissect them and translate them to 3D, it doesn't always work 100%. And then you kind of have to use your brain and improvise. Um, I just left it as it was at this point, though, to continue brewing on it in my mind while I worked on getting some other pieces through. But I'll eventually go through the steps I went through to kind of get these feeling more connected. So here I'm just using mask and extract to pull out these kind of hair dread pieces from our original primary form, which was basically just like a giant lump. And because we were happy with like the overall shape of this simple, more primitive form, we really don't need to do much work to just pull the hair dreads out. Even though they have like smaller shapes of their own, we still want their overall shape when put together to kind of represent this larger primitive form. And I'm also going through and just kind of positioning them in a way that they're just angled in different directions and using that 3D space instead of just working on like a few planes. So yeah, sometimes you'll kind of see me obsessively going back to the clothes every once in a while at this phase to like sculpt just a little bit more in. And it's because I'm still not really sure how I want to style the clothes in terms of like the folds and the creases. I'm still just testing things out, and I feel like I've landed in a good spot now where it's kind of hard and crisp, and I like that showing against the softer forms that kind of make up the silhouettes of the clothes. It reminds me of like she's like a balloon at the top and it kind of like suctions in at the ends. And I just feel like it has like a nice tension to it. So now I'll start working out some of the more complex forms in this dress, which is still a bit lumpy and primitive. So a cool trick I learned from working on a bunch of other like roughly frilly types of clothing before is I'll just kind of like go to the bottom of this thick dress mesh and I'll mask out this kind of squiggly looking line, which is supposed to kind of follow the form of your ruffles. And I'll extract a pretty wide extraction and then just delete one side of it. And this becomes like the kind of base for your ruffles or frills. Then we're going to clean up this one-sided mesh a bit more from the basic extraction and then extrude a bit of thickness using Z Modeler. I'll leave it as is for a while now just so I can work on the rest of the dress in some other areas, but we'll definitely need to go back and manually sculpt and fix some of the ruffles. But for now, this is like a super quick and easy way to get some of those ruffles represented. So now here I'm just going to go into the big skirt and start pulling out the secondary forms, which are basically just the trimmings, as well as getting started on the leather belt harness thing that sits on top of the skirt and like holds all of her accessories up. So here I'm using a technique that you've probably seen me use a lot already in some kind of shape or form. And basically it's what I'll use whenever I want to keep the mesh topology and the sculpt super clean. First I'll extract the shape that I want from a mask that I've painted out, then I'll delete everything except the faces on one side of that extraction. And then I'll just move the single vertices around until I get the one-sided mesh all clean and proper before I extrude the thickness I want at the very end using Z Modeler. This is basically a workaround and kind of quick substitute, so I don't have to go in and manually model out these pieces for just like clean topology at the lowest subdivision. While the mesh is one-sided, I also really like using relax instead of smooth to keep the form from doing this weird dipping motion between the outer edges. You can use relax by holding shift like you would if you were normally smoothing. So shift and then click down with your pen and then release shift. Then afterwards you can move your pen around as if you were smoothing, but instead it'll do more of a relaxing kind of motion on the verts. Relax is good for a lot of other things too, but I almost always use it when I'm working with one-sided meshes since the normal smooth doesn't really handle them super well. I'll pause the process here and just leave the belt low poly to make sure I get some other pieces ironed out around it before subdividing the belt subtool more. But when I'm looking to smooth things out and want to add more details, I'll usually crease the edges that I want to stay hard, then subdivide like normal with smooth turned on. Before my final subdivision though, I'll uncrease everything and divide one last time so that the edges kind of smooth over ever so slightly, and it just gives it a bit more of a natural kind of tiny beveled edge rather than having it stay super crisp and CG looking. That's something I really like to push a lot in my work. I don't really like it when my sculpts look overly sharp and too crisp. I always feel like they start to feel a bit robotic at that point, and I just love interjecting with a bit of wonkiness or softer edges while still keeping the sculpting clean. So I'm going to start going into a bit of tertiary detail now. It's a little early since some other pieces are still just kind of like primary or secondary lumps. It's not a big deal though, because the bag is like a separate piece from everything else. And plus I'm just kind of getting like really antsy and I really want to figure out how to do some of these smaller like intricate gold designs and filigree on the bag itself. I've had some ideas in my head, like just thinking about it this whole time, and some real life photo references, but there's no way I could be 100% until I actually start trying stuff. So I really wanted to just get that out of the way. So I had to make a decision here whether I wanted to paint in this filigree detail, just like the rest of the smaller patterns on the rest of the dress. Because it's a really simple piece though, and there's not much going on the surface of the actual bag itself, I decided to just sculpt it in. I knew I wanted to bake it down into a flat surface in low poly, but at least the normal map will still give it a bit of oomph. And I also decided to model out the geometry, at least just for the upper part of the gold filigree design-ish thing, into the top of the bag. Since if you're looking at the bag from the front angle, it could be like a nice silhouette break to have at the top of the bag. Just because the form of the bag itself is a bit more primitive, and I wanted to add something just a bit more interesting to the shape of it. Even though with this pipeline you're getting to do all the creative artsy fartsy stuff first with like sculpting, it's still really good to keep in mind how our sculpt is going to be used in the following step and to be mindful about just how we want to like structure things and prepare it for its following low poly stage. And here I've tried to just get a secondary pass done on the pillowy bit of the nest on the back and the nest itself. But I changed this bit later since it wasn't really looking right. I'll talk more about this later when I go back to working on the nest, since it was a pretty big hurdle for me on this character, and yeah, we'll get into it later. I'll let the time lapse continue to roll here, but since we have a bit of time, I thought I'd just kind of sneak in my little spiel about the importance of just studying real life, I guess, even when we're working with more stylized approaches. So I'm sure you've heard this said like a million times before by other artists, but it really is crucial for 3D character artists of all kind to learn real anatomy. Basically, to be able to stylize bodily forms and proportions, especially if you want to be able to work in a variety of different styles, it's mega important to figure out how the base is actually built and what rules apply in order to be able to bend them. And this applies to pretty much everything, not just anatomy for stylized characters. For instance, with these cloth folds, we really need to understand how creasing and folding works first, with a number of different materials in order to figure out how to stylize it in a believable way, or find some good real life references at the very least. Something I don't hear as much, but personally I think is almost equally as important, is to study how other artists like to interpret anatomy and other things as well, aka how they choose to stylize. Especially if you find yourself drawn to character artists that work in kind of adjacent styles, it might be good to do a bit of analysis and see why you're drawn to their characters and their stylization. And maybe ask yourself why they choose to stylize specific pieces of their character certain ways, like what that conveys to the viewer or what that adds to the character's design. It might sound pretty overwhelming if you're just starting out, and I mean, thinking about all this stuff I don't know still overwhelms me on a daily basis, but it's good to remind yourself that these things happen slowly over time and never all at once. As long as you're taking proactive steps to learn, you'll find yourself getting more and more comfortable sculpting all kinds of things as you go. But yeah, that's just my unsolicited advice from being a pretty anxious artist overall, throughout my entire career, pretty much. I don't know, maybe it'll help some other artists out there that are in a position currently that I was like really stuck in before, and just like really struggle to learn all the things. I'm also kind of a chronic overthinker, so I'll keep kind of sprinkling my general thoughts and advice throughout this demo, and I hope it provides some more insight into my journey, and I don't know, hopefully it'll be helpful for yours too. So this is the point where I had mentally brewed enough and gathered more refs where I felt ready to retackle the hair and puff thingies. Um, so the most useful refs are the ones I'll show here, which were these photos of Amandla Stenberg and this fawn concept or fawn centaur concept from Koa Viet. So instead of having them too hard and angular and stiff, like they are currently, I wanted to see if I could make them feel more like the other bits of hair that are slightly more messy in texture. And you can tell it's like a more poofy, kind of uncooperative type of hair. I won't show how I sculpted all of them out in the interest of time, but you get the idea. Even though it's super sped up here and some parts are cut out, just the hair itself took a lot of iteration to get to a point that I liked. I tried other styles in the tails themselves too, like braids in a couple different ways, but they always got too noisy and were starting to feel more like they were the centerpiece instead of serving as a background for a girl's face. But I think I landed in a pretty okay spot with the style and shape of the hair that I've gone with now. So I get asked pretty often how I like to sculpt my hair, so I thought I'd take this time to just make kind of like a quick breakdown slash tutorial of that. And it's going to be pretty disappointing because it's really not that complicated. But basically, all I do is take my clay buildup brush and I just use that to make some like nice, organic, like natural feeling forms. And then I'll go over that with one of my favorite brushes called, it's like capital MAH lowercase cut underscore mech A brush. Um, and I'll use that to sculpt out a lot of the planar faces. I use it in a lot of different contexts, but specifically I always use it in hair because I just find it's like a great way to kind of represent hair strands and the movement of hair without it getting too noisy in the sculpt. And basically all it does is like create a pinched line where you're drawing. I mean, you can either pinch it upwards or like pinch it downwards, just like the actual pinch brush that comes with ZBrush. But I just find it does it in a more organic, easy to control way. And it's a bit more relaxed as well because the pinch brush itself will kind of pinch your topology along with it in kind of a harsh manner, but this one is a bit easier to control. So I mentioned the MAH Cut Mech A brush that I really liked, and now that we're really getting into the nitty-gritty of sculpting, I thought I'd take a moment to kind of go through the other brushes that I usually use the most and some of the custom ones I've added too. I don't really do anything that too complicated in terms of using brushes. A lot of the work I like to do is manual because I like getting in that kind of handcrafted feeling. Um, but just to go through a few, so like I said, my absolute favorite is that Mech A brush, and obviously just move topology. Probably 80% of my sculpts are just a combination of these two brushes, which are my absolute favorites. Another brush I really like is this clay buildup brush that just comes with ZBrush out of the box. And I've always preferred using it over like standard or some other brush to build up forms, just because it's got like this more natural textury kind of feeling and makes it feel as if you're like uh, putting on actual like wet clay or something. Obviously, it's like a bit too gritty for the stylized style that I usually work in. But I really like just lumping this on first. For instance, like if I was working on hair, I would just use it to quickly follow the flow of the hair and just like lump it on super roughly. Um, and from there, I can kind of like smooth it out a bit and start to see like these subtle shapes forming, just kind of like happy little accidents, I guess. And I'll take my Mech A brush from there and just uh, getting those shapes to start feel a lot cleaner and like carving them out a bit more. And then I also like to use the inflate brush a lot just to, fix like Dynamesh issues or artifacts, or just to like puff things up a little bit in a aesthetic way, especially when I'm working on like more simple and like cuter sculpts that need to be more clean. I like to use inflate a bit more. And then of course H polish and trim dynamic just to get those hard planar faces that are always super important and stylized. Another one of my favorite brushes that doesn't come with ZBrush, so it's a bit more custom, is Orb Cracks from Mike Vicente. And you can get a whole set of these orb brushes from his Gumroad, and they're good for like all kinds of different scenarios. But specifically, I use Orb Cracks the most, which is like I find a bit more flexible and versatile in a lot of different cases. And at least in my eyes, I kind of just see it as a substitute for like Damn Standard, which comes with ZBrush. And same thing with the Mech A brush. I just find this to be an easier version to control um, rather than the ZBrush default. And yeah, it's just like a bit more relaxed and like subtle in a lot of ways. So here's a couple of those custom brushes that I mentioned being used together in combination just to give you an idea of what they do. So for the creasing that goes across the ends of these puff sleeves in this more like thick knitted material, I'm just using the Orb Cracks brush first to draw in those lines, and they're pretty superficial at this point. But then I'll retrace over those lines with that Mech A brush that I talked about, which really adds just a bit of depth to those creases.